Just a nurse. That's what Dr. Caldwell had said 3 months ago when Elena Martinez arrived at Sacred Heart. Not a greeting. Not a welcome. A category. A dismissal wrapped in 4 words and a glance that lasted half a second. He didn't know. None of them knew. They saw the tremor in her hands when she reached for coffee at 2 a.m., and they made assumptions. Nervousness. Inexperience. Weakness. What they didn't understand was that those same hands had once held 147 lives in Ramadi, had moved with the precision of a combat surgeon under incoming mortar fire, had carried 3 wounded Marines across open ground while rounds tore the air around her. What they didn't know was that the quiet nurse reviewing medication logs at 2:53 a.m. in the silent ICU was the reason 214 Marines came home instead of 213. But none of that mattered anymore. All that mattered was the discrepancy staring back at her from Commander James Harding's chart. The fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical pulse overhead, a sound like electricity wearing down bone by bone. Elena sat at the nursing station on the 3rd floor of Sacred Heart Hospital in Houston, the ICU wing where the cases lived that nobody talked about at dinner parties. Long-term comas. Vegetative states. The waiting game that families played in cafeterias, hoping for miracles while hope itself began to calcify. The hospital smelled like antiseptic and broken promises, that particular chemical blend of bleach and human decay that no amount of industrial cleaning could fully mask. Her fingers traced the columns of Harding's medication log, cross-referencing timestamps with vital signs, with consciousness levels, with the biological markers that separated a sleeping patient from one being held under deliberately. The numbers didn't add up. Commander James Harding had been admitted to Sacred Heart 2 years and 4 months ago with severe traumatic brain injury from an IED blast in Ramadi. Ramadi. The same city where Elena's hands had learned their craft, where her muscle memory had been forged in blood and necessity, where she'd met the man whose name was written across this chart in clinical terminology that couldn't capture who he actually was. The sedation protocol started standard, 5 milligrams of propofol, reasonable dosing for a patient in coma, pain management, basic ICU care. Elena traced her finger down the dates. 3 months after admission, dosage increased to 7 milligrams, 6 months, 10 milligrams, 9 months, 12 milligrams. 1 year, the entries became less frequent, but when they appeared, the doses had crept into dangerous territory. 14 milligrams, 15 milligrams. Sometimes double doses in a single shift. A comatose patient didn't need escalating sedation. A comatose patient's neurological status wouldn't improve with increasing medication designed to suppress consciousness. Elena knew this because before the shrapnel, before the medical discharge, before she'd become a ghost haunting night shifts in a Houston ICU, she'd been Major Elena Martinez, Marine Corps medical officer. She'd completed 2 full tours in Ramadi and halfway through a 3rd. She'd read pharmacology the way other people read novels, not for leisure, but because lives depended on the accuracy. And nothing in this chart made sense except for one explanation she didn't want to consider. She leaned closer, pulling the tablet toward her, the edges of her vision narrowing into that combat focus that used to activate under fire and hadn't fully deactivated in 5 years. The medication administration records, the vitals logged by day nurses, the neurological assessments that consistently noted no change in status, patient remains unresponsive to stimuli. But propofol at those doses should have been noted differently. Should have shown metabolic changes. Should have included more aggressive monitoring. Instead, the documentation was sparse, almost perfunctory. Like someone was going through the motions of care while actively preventing care from occurring. That's when the shadow fell. Elena's hand didn't jerk away from the chart. Her jaw didn't tighten. Years of field medicine had taught her that visible reactions could cost lives, and 5 years of civilian silence had reinforced the lesson. She looked up with the perfect blend of deference and calm that she'd perfected over 3 months at Sacred Heart, the look that said she was unthreatening, competent but not remarkable, exactly the kind of night nurse you forgot about 3 minutes after you stopped talking to her. Dr. Caldwell stood in the doorway of the nursing station, 6 feet 1 inch and cultivated, the kind of man whose presence made the air pressure change. Expensive watch, than Omega, Elena's eyes caught the detail automatically, and scrubs that were somehow pristine despite being worn at 2 a.m. His dark hair showed exactly one distinguished grey streak at the temple, the kind that looked accidental and had probably cost him $300 at a salon. His eyes were already measuring her, already calculating whether she was a problem he needed to address. "You're reviewing charts at this hour." Not a question. A statement that implied she had no business doing so. Elena closed the tablet by sliding her fingers across the screen. Medication reconciliation. Part of shift handoff. The words came out soft, reasonable. She used the voice she'd been practicing, the one that apologized for existing. Commander Harding's records. He stepped closer, and she could smell his cologne, something sharp and European that didn't belong in a hospital. "That's not your patient tonight. I cover all the coma patients on night rotation. Part of the protocol." She looked back at the chart, a deliberate shift that said she was returning to work, that his presence was merely an interruption. Inside her jacket, sewn carefully into the lining just above her heart, was a faded unit patch from the 1st Battalion, 5th Marines, Dark Horse Company. Her fingers twitched toward it, that old nervous habit, before she caught herself. She gripped the edge of the desk instead. Caldwell's eyes narrowed. He was the kind of man who didn't appreciate being dismissed, who understood hierarchies as immutable laws. Chief of the Critical Care Unit for 7 years. Board certified in emergency medicine and critical care. The kind of doctor who arrived at Sacred Heart and made immediate changes, streamlined protocols, established his authority with the quiet efficiency of someone used to being obeyed. Elena had heard about him her first week, the whispered conversations in the break room, "Don't question Caldwell. He doesn't tolerate dissent." Last nurse who pushed back was transferred within a month. "The medication orders are written by the day team," Caldwell said, his voice the kind of calm that preceded consequences. "Your role is to administer them, not review them." Elena didn't respond immediately. The fluorescent lights continued their hum overhead, that electrical pulse that seemed to accelerate her heartbeat. Somewhere in the hospital, a monitor beeped steadily in another patient's room, sinus rhythm, stable, the sound of a body still willing to work toward survival. In room 447, just down the corridor, Commander James Harding lay motionless under medication that was holding him down far more aggressively than any head injury could. "I understand," Elena said, and there was truth in that statement but not the truth Caldwell was hearing. She did understand. She understood because she'd stood over operating tables in field hospitals under mortar fire and watched medications become weapons. She understood because she'd been trained to notice when a dose was too high, too prolonged, too intentional. She understood because the man in room 447 had commanded the unit that brought her son home in a flag-draped coffin, and she suddenly couldn't breathe around that realization. Caldwell watched her for 3 more seconds, then nodded once, a dismissal. "Get some coffee. You're going to make errors if you're thinking too hard." He said it like a kindness, the way you might pat a dog on the head while stepping on its tail. Elena waited until he'd returned to his office before she let herself move. She stood, pushing the chair back with deliberate slowness, and walked to the break room at the end of the corridor. The hallway was silent except for the whisper of the ventilation system and the soft thud of her rubber-soled shoes on linoleum. The break room was empty, smelling like burnt coffee and the stale edges of a shift change. She poured herself a cup from the pot that had been sitting since midnight, the liquid dark and bitter as blood, and wrapped both hands around the mug. The tremor in her hands was worse now. It came from the memory, unbidden and violent. Ramadi, 2017, Forward Operating Base Shank, a Thursday that started like any other Thursday. Elena had been 28 years old and believed she was invincible, the kind of magical thinking that soldiers needed to survive. She'd completed 43 field surgeries that week, 43 men and women brought to her tent with wounds that shouldn't have been survivable, and somehow most of them had lived because her hands knew things her brain had never had to consciously learn. A field thoracotomy with a combat knife took for minutes if you were fast. 3 if you were desperate. She'd been both, multiple times. That Thursday, her convoy had been hit returning from a forward patrol. The roadside bomb had been small, small enough that everyone should have walked away, small enough that in any other circumstance it would have been forgotten by the next day. But the second vehicle, the one carrying Lieutenant Marcus Chen and 2 junior Marines, had been directly over the detonation point. Elena had been in the first vehicle. She'd heard the blast, that sound like the world splitting open, and she'd moved without thinking. Her muscle memory had taken over before her conscious mind caught up. She'd run toward the smoke. She'd pulled Chen out of the burning wreckage with her hands, leaving strips of her own skin and flesh on the hot metal. The shrapnel had come from the second explosion, from the secondary device that the convoy leader suspected had been waiting specifically for the response team. Elena had heard it more than felt it, a sound like 1,000 angry hornets, and then the impact against her left side, and then she was on the ground, and Marcus Chen was screaming, and there was so much blood that she couldn't tell whose was whose. That's when Commander Harding had found her. He'd been the commanding officer of the unit providing security for the convoy, a man with 30 years of tactical experience and the kind of calm that came from having already survived the unsurvivable. He'd carried her toward the evacuation Humvee while maintaining fire with his other hand, a feat of coordination that shouldn't have been physically possible. But what Elena remembered most clearly was his voice, that steady operator's tone. Medical Officer Martinez is priority evacuation. Move now. Her son, Michael, had been a lance corporal in that security unit. 22 years old. On his first deployment. She'd never seen him alive again. The coffee cup nearly slipped from her hands. Elena caught it with her fingertips and set it down carefully on the break room counter. Around her, the fluorescent lights continued their mechanical pulse. The clock on the wall read 3:14 a.m. 3 hours and 46 minutes until the day shift arrived, until the hospital came alive with morning meetings and structured chaos. 3 hours and 46 minutes until Dr. Caldwell's day began, until he started writing orders for a man who'd already given everything to this country, a man who was being held under medication that seemed designed to prevent something very specific. Elena closed her eyes. She could still feel the combat knife in her hand, the strange weight and balance of it, the way cold metal felt against warm blood when you were trying to open a chest cavity in a tent that smelled like diesel fuel and death. She could still hear the monitor beeping as a soldier's heart rate climbed back toward the living. She could remember exactly what it felt like to save someone's life. But she couldn't remember what it felt like to fail. Not until tonight. Not until she'd seen those medication logs and understood that someone, somewhere, had decided that Commander James Harding's survival wasn't worth protecting. That whatever reason he had to stay alive had become less important than keeping him unconscious. Sedated. Silent. Elena opened her eyes and looked at her reflection in the break room window, the fluorescent lights behind her making her look like a ghost, which was about right. Just a nurse. That's what Caldwell had said. That's what she'd been trying to be for 5 years, ever since the medical discharge, ever since she'd handed over her rank and her weapons and her role in the world that made sense. Just a nurse in Houston, working night shifts, invisible, trying to forget that she'd ever been someone else. But the chart in room 447 was telling a different story. 3 days of rotating shifts. That was Caldwell's first move, and it was surgical in its precision. Elena checked the new schedule posted outside the ICU and felt the architecture of it immediately: Monday graveyard, Wednesday swing, Friday days, then back to graveyard. Designed to fracture her circadian rhythm, to keep her off Commander Harding's primary care team, to make her invisible by scattering her across the hospital like shrapnel. She'd seen this tactic before, not in Houston but in Ramadi, watching officers systematically reassign Marines who asked the wrong questions. The principle was identical: isolation through motion. What Caldwell didn't know was that Elena had spent 5 years perfecting the art of invisibility on purpose. She moved through Sacred Heart's corridors in her scrubs like a ghost, clocking in at 2,100 hours for her first midnight shift under the new rotation, greeting no one, stopping at no one's desk. The fluorescent lights above the ICU cast everything in that particular hospital green that made skin look jaundiced. She started her rounds methodically, checking monitors, adjusting fall lines, doing what a nurse was supposed to do. But her eyes kept tracking back to room 447, where Commander Harding lay motionless beneath white sheets, his chest rising and falling to the rhythm of the ventilator. The hiss of air. The steady beep. The sedation line climbing higher on his chart each week. Caldwell appeared during morning rounds on her second day back, moving through the ICU with the kind of confidence that came from knowing the institution would bend to his will. Elena was reviewing Harding's medication log at the nurse's station when she heard his voice drop into that particular register, the one he reserved for people beneath him. She looked up. Caldwell was standing in the hallway with 3 attending physicians, and his eyes had locked onto her like a targeting system. Nurse Martinez. A moment. Not a request. The voice of someone accustomed to obedience. Elena set down the chart and approached. The attending physicians didn't scatter yet, they were waiting for whatever was about to happen. Caldwell held up Harding's file, letting it hang between them like evidence of a crime she hadn't committed. I notice you've been reviewing the sedation protocols on Commander Harding. His tone was conversational, but each word landed with weight. Perhaps you could explain why a staff nurse believes she's qualified to second-guess physician orders. The attending physicians were watching now. One of them was trying not to smile. Elena kept her voice level. The sedative escalation doesn't match standard ICU dosing for prolonged coma management, doctor. The literature suggests. The literature. Caldwell's laugh was sharp, cutting. Your job is to empty bedpans and monitor vitals, not practice medicine. Where did you receive your advanced pharmacology training, exactly? Or did you perhaps sleep through that section of nursing school? He glanced at his colleagues with theatrical disdain. I wonder if Sacred Heart's credentialing committee would be interested in reviewing your original transcript. One of the physicians actually smiled. Elena felt something shift in her chest, not fear, not anger. Clarity. Her hands remained steady. Her voice didn't waver. She held Caldwell's gaze and spoke quietly, just loud enough for the nearby nurses to hear. Commander Harding deserves care based on medical evidence, not institutional convenience, doctor. That's what I was trained to do. Caldwell's jaw tightened. His eyes narrowed. For one moment, something flashed across his face, recognition, maybe. Then it was gone, replaced by a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Your concern is noted and dismissed. Return to your assigned tasks. He turned away, his colleagues falling into step beside him like a honor guard. Elena went back to the nurse's station. The other staff members who had been listening suddenly found urgent tasks elsewhere. The break room would do the same, she realized. The coordinated silence would begin immediately. It did. She sat down with her lunch the next day, a container of arroz con pollo she'd prepared at home, still warm in the break room microwave. She'd been there for perhaps 90 seconds when the door began to open and close in rapid succession. Within 30 seconds, the break room was empty. A nurse she'd worked with for 3 months stood in the doorway for just long enough to make eye contact, then turned and left. Another resident who'd asked her for advice on ICU protocols 3 days prior suddenly had urgent charting to complete. Elena ate alone. She would eat alone for 8 straight shifts. The formal write-up appeared on the unit board on a Thursday, posted where every nurse and physician in the ICU could see it. Elena was standing at the medication dispensary when Caldwell arrived with Commander Harding's elderly parents, Mr. and Mrs. Harding in their 70s, Mr. Harding moving carefully with a cane, Mrs. Harding's hand trembling on his arm. Caldwell directed them toward the unit board with the smooth professionalism of a tour guide, his voice warm and solicitous as he talked about his dedication to their son's care. Then he pointed to the write-up. Our nursing staff is held to the highest standards, Caldwell was saying, and Elena's name was right there in bold print, along with the accusations, inappropriate chart access, insubordination, violation of nursing scope of practice. When someone steps outside their lane, we address it immediately. Patient safety depends on clear hierarchy and protocol adherence. Mrs. Harding was reading the board, confusion clouding her face. Elena could see the moment the realization arrived, the nurse who had been so kind to her, who had held Mrs. Harding's hand yesterday, who had promised to watch over her son. That nurse was apparently incompetent. That nurse couldn't be trusted. Elena didn't move. She didn't approach. She didn't defend herself. She simply stood at the medication dispensary, hand steady, and watched the damage be meticulously applied, brick by brick, to the wall between her and any hope of saving Commander Harding. Caldwell noticed her standing there. His eyes met hers for a fraction of a second, and in that moment, Elena understood. He wanted her to see this. He wanted her to understand what happened to people who asked too many questions, who looked too closely at his charts, who threatened the stories he'd constructed about his patients. That afternoon, Elena checked her new assignment schedule posted in the staff office. Monday night shift. Wednesday afternoon. Friday morning. Sunday evening. Then back to Monday night. Every rotation shifted by 6 hours, designed to keep her moving, to prevent her from ever settling into Harding's primary care window, to ensure that someone else, someone obedient, would be present for whatever happened next in room for 47. The isolation through motion. The erasure through scheduling. The perfect institutional weapon. She didn't realize that Caldwell was watching her study the schedule until she heard his voice behind her, pitched so that everyone in the nearby offices could hear. Effective Monday, Martinez, you're being transferred to psychiatric services. I believe your personality and skill set are better suited to that environment. The transfer request is already processed with HR. You'll be reassigned before your next shift. The words landed like a gavel. The other staff members in the office suddenly found reasons to be elsewhere. Elena stood alone in front of the schedule board, her transfer order effective in 72 hours, her access to Commander Harding's care team severed before it could do any more damage to Caldwell's plans. She turned around slowly. Caldwell was already walking away, his satisfaction audible in the rhythm of his footsteps. Elena should have accepted it. She should have packed her things, transferred to psychiatric, and let the hospital machinery continue. Should have become invisible in an entirely different way. But she'd learned in Ramadi that sometimes the only way forward was to trust the instinct that had kept her alive through shrapnel and ambush and the weight of decisions that got people killed. The instinct that told her something was profoundly wrong in room for 47, and that Caldwell's desperation to remove her was confirmation. That night, Elena accessed the medical records system using credentials she hadn't used in 5 years, credentials tied to her previous life, her previous name, her previous rank. The login required her military medical ID, and her hands hovered over the keyboard for a moment before she entered it. She'd been trying so hard to be just a nurse in Houston, invisible, small, safe. But invisibility wasn't going to save Commander Harding. She started cross-referencing Harding's Coma timeline with deployment records from Ramadi. IED blast, admitted to forward operating base shank with moderate head trauma. Cognitive assessment 2 days post-injury, fully alert. Witness interviews on day 3. Then Dr. Caldwell assigned as consulting physician. Within 48 hours, altered mental status, deepening unconsciousness. Sedation protocols initiated. Patient slipped into coma state within 72 hours of Caldwell's involvement. The pattern was unmistakable. She dug deeper, finding a buried incident report with a redacted surgeon's name, a friendly fire investigation, 3 Marines killed in a unit that had nothing to do with friendly fire. The timelines aligned. The location matched. Caldwell had been there. Caldwell had been at FOB Shank when whatever happened, happened. Elena's computer access was suspended the next afternoon. A notification appeared on her hospital email at 1,347 hours. Your account has been locked pending security review. Unauthorized access to classified military medical records has been flagged. Contact IT immediately. She had been there at 0300 hours. Photographing documents with her phone. Her hands had been steady, but her pulse had been moving like a hummingbird's wings. Caldwell knew she was digging. More than that, Caldwell was moving to shut her down before she could expose whatever he'd buried in room for 47. That evening, Elena stood in the cemetery on Bellaria Boulevard where her husband was buried, the Houston heat pressing down like a physical thing. Rain threatened in the distance, dark clouds banking against the horizon. She placed her hand against his headstone, Marcus Santos, 1982 to 2011, Marine Infantry, beloved husband and father, and the stone was warm under her palm, radiating the day's heat. "I found the patient," she whispered. "The one you tried to save. The one who commanded your unit." She paused, watching the clouds move. "Caldwell is keeping him sedated. Deliberately. I don't know all the reasons yet, but the timeline is perfect. The pattern is there." She didn't mention that she'd served with both of them in Ramadi. That she'd watched her husband's coffin draped with a flag and flown home on a CR-17 Globemaster. That she'd spent 5 years trying to forget who she'd been. "I don't know how to save him without destroying myself," Elena said to the stone, to the man beneath it, to the ghost of the person she used to be. "And that scares me more than anything Caldwell could do." The wind picked up from the west, carrying the smell of rain across the cemetery. Elena turned her face to it and waited for the storm. The storm came that night, rain hammering the apartment windows like shrapnel on metal. Elena sat at her kitchen table with 3 manila folders spread before her, each one illuminated by the pale glow of her laptop screen at 2:16 a.m. The classified military database glowed behind layers of encrypted access code she still had clearance to use 7 years post-discharge, and they'd never revoked it, probably forgotten she existed at all. The first folder contained Commander Harding's medication timeline. She'd photographed every page of his chart during her final nights before the transfer, her hand steady as a surgical laser as she documented the escalating sedation protocol. Propofol increased by 12 milligrams per week. Midazolam bumped from 2 milligrams every 4 hours to 4 milligrams every 2. Each notation in Caldwell's handwriting read the same: patient agitation, increased anxiety, pharmacological management required. The dates blurred together until Elena stopped looking at them as numbers and started reading them as a story written in narcotics. The second folder held military deployment records. She'd accessed the Marine Corps casualty database using her old credentials, her hands moving across the keyboard with the muscle memory of someone who'd filed medical reports on this exact system a decade ago. Ramadi. Jolin District. 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines, Dark Horse Company. She cross-referenced every combat casualty from her dates of service, traced every friendly fire incident that had been investigated and buried in the declassified archives. Most of them had names redacted. Some didn't. The third folder held the truth, and it was written in blood. The date jumped out at her, July 18, 2008. 3 Marines KIA in what the official reports called a surgical airstrike coordination failure. Friendly fire. A Navy surgeon had been present during the incident, someone on the FOB who'd been in the wrong place at the wrong time, or maybe the right place for the wrong reasons. The report named him only as N. Caldwell, MD, Navy Medical Corps. The incident had been investigated, the surgeon exonerated, the case closed with the kind of finality that only came when the right people decided the story was over. Elena opened the military database one more time, her fingers moving through layers of classified information like she was reading Braille in the dark. 7 days after the incident, the same Dr. Caldwell had been reassigned stateside to Houston. 6 months later, he'd separated from the Navy with a medical discharge and a pension. 2 years after that, he'd appeared on the Sacred Heart staff roster as an attending physician in the ICU. Commander James Harding, according to the records Elena pulled, had been present during that same incident. He'd been a junior officer then, 24 years old, watching from another vehicle as 3 of his men died in the crossfire. He'd survived. He'd come home. And then he'd gone back to Ramadi 2 more times before an IED blast had left him unable to testify about what he'd seen on that day in July. Elena closed the laptop slowly. The apartment felt too small suddenly, the walls breathing in and out like lungs. She understood now what Caldwell had been doing. Not cruelty. Strategic silence. Harding Coma wasn't an accident, it was an insurance policy. As long as the commander couldn't speak, the friendly fire incident couldn't be reopened. As long as Harding stayed sedated, no military tribunal could demand testimony. As long as he was unconscious, no one would ever know that the Navy had sent home a surgeon who'd cost 3 Marines their lives. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was what happened next. Elena's phone rang at 6:14 a.m. She hadn't slept. She was still sitting at the kitchen table with the folders open, her husband's photograph from Ramadi staring up at her from inside the military discharge papers, her in-dress uniform, younger and unmarked by shrapnel, standing beside a smiling Commander Harding before either of them understood how the war would rewrite their lives. She answered without checking the caller ID. "Elena." Caldwell's voice came through the phone line like gravel in a gear. Not a greeting. A threat. "We need to discuss some concerns that have come to our attention regarding your nursing license and your mental health status." She didn't respond. Silence was better than denial. "The Texas Board of Nursing received an inquiry this morning about your clinical judgment and your emotional stability. Someone reported that you've become fixated on a specific patient in a way that suggests you may be experiencing grief-related psychosis. They mentioned that your son was killed in Iraq. Is that accurate, Elena?" Her jaw tightened. She could feel the muscles in her neck cord like rope. "The board is opening an informal inquiry. That means your credentials are under review. You'll need to submit to a psychological evaluation. In the meantime, you're being reassigned away from Commander Harding's care team, effective immediately. Your access to the ICU is being revoked pending the outcome of the investigation. Security will be notified." The phone line crackled. Rain hammered the windows. "You made a serious mistake when you started digging into that patient's chart, Elena. You crossed a line between professional care and personal obsession. The board takes that very seriously. I suggest you get a lawyer and prepare yourself for what's coming." He hung up before she could respond. The silence that followed felt like being underwater. By 8 o'clock, the hospital had moved. Elena received a text message from Sarah, the only nurse who'd still made eye contact with her in the break room. "Caldwell just reassigned everyone from your last 3 shifts. He's building something. Watch yourself." By noon, the Texas Board of Nursing had officially opened a file under Elena's name. She knew this because her phone rang at 12:13 p.m. and a woman with a professional voice asked her about her education, her licensing dates, her clinical experience, and whether she'd ever treated a patient while experiencing emotional distress related to personal loss. By 3 p.m., security had changed her badge access codes. She tried to enter Sacred Heart for her evening shift and the doors didn't recognize her. A guard she'd never seen before checked her ID, spoke quietly into a radio, and said, "I'm sorry, your access has been restricted. You'll need to speak with HR." She didn't try to argue. Composure meant knowing when the room had already decided against you. Elena sat in her car in the Sacred Heart parking garage, the engine running, her hands at 10 and 2 on the steering wheel. The smell of diesel exhaust and wet concrete filled the car. Her phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number. "Elena. It's Sarah. Don't come in tomorrow. Caldwell is telling everyone you're unstable. He's saying you might hurt a patient. HR is building a termination file. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." Another buzz, but listen. "Tuesday night. I'm calling in sick. Someone's covering my shift. You should know that." Elena looked at her phone screen. The words glowed white against black. Tuesday night. 3 days away. The ICU would be understaffed, rotating coverage, the kind of shift chaos where a nurse could slip into a patient's room without being tracked through the regular channels. The kind of opening that only came if you were willing to lose everything to take it. She drove home in the rain, her husband's old Marine Corps jacket on the passenger seat beside her. The jacket that had traveled through 2 wars and 15 years of peace, that smelled still like the dust of Ramadi and the diesel exhaust of Black Hawks, that carried on the inside of its lining a faded unit patch sewn by her own hands the day he'd shipped out for his first deployment. In her apartment, Elena opened the closet. Behind the winter coats and the shoes she never wore, there was a locked metal box painted dull green. Her hands knew the combination without thinking, the 18th of July, '08. The date she'd last worn a uniform. Inside were the things she'd stopped being. Her military ID card, Major Elena Martinez, Marine Corps medical officer, photograph taken when her eye still held the kind of certainty that only came before you'd seen what war actually cost. Her discharge papers, stamped medical retirement, 2 pages that explained in bureaucratic language why she was no longer allowed to serve. The medals lay in their cases, a bronze star with Valor, a silver star, 2 purple hearts, and underneath them all, a Navy Cross with a citation she'd never read because reading it meant admitting that she'd done something worth remembering. And a photograph. Her in dress uniform standing beside a younger Commander Harding at FOB Shank, a FOB ceremony in 2007, both of them smiling, both of them unaware that the next year would contain July 18th and the 3 Marines and the friendly fire incident that would hollow out everything that came after. She closed the box. Not yet. She still wasn't ready to be Major Martinez again. But Tuesday night was coming. The rain kept falling. Elena sat on her apartment floor, her back against the bed frame, staring at the locked box. She'd spent 7 years teaching herself how to be invisible, how to be just a nurse, how to carry the weight of what she'd done in the war without letting anyone see the scars. She'd rebuilt her life in silence, worked night shifts in a hospital where no one asked questions, lived in a city that didn't know her name. Caldwell had forced her hand. In trying to destroy her, he'd reminded her of exactly what she was capable of being. The intercom buzzed at 6 o'clock. Elena didn't move until the buzz came again, urgent and sharp. She answered without asking who it was. Elena? It's Sarah. I'm in the parking garage. Don't ask me how I got your address. We need to talk. They sat in Sarah's car in the rain. The windshield wipers moved like metronomes. Sarah was 28, for years out of nursing school, the kind of nurse who still believed the system was supposed to work. Her hands shook against the steering wheel. Caldwell had a meeting with the care team this morning, Sarah said. He showed us a memo saying you've been accessing classified patient information without authorization. He told us you might be experiencing a mental health crisis related to your son's death. He said we shouldn't talk to you. He said if any of us spoke in your defense, it could affect our own licensees. Elena listened without responding. But that's not what I came to tell you, Sarah continued. I came to tell you that I'm calling in sick tomorrow night. And when I do, someone else is covering my shift in the ICU. Someone who doesn't owe Caldwell anything. Someone who's going to be in the building whether he likes it or not. She pulled a folded piece of paper from her pocket. A shift schedule. Tuesday night. 7 p.m. to 7 a.m. Elena's name wasn't on it, but the gaps in coverage told their own story. I don't know what you're planning, Sarah said. I don't want to know. But if you're going to do something, Tuesday night is when it happens. After that, they'll have you fired. They'll have your license revoked. The investigation will be closed and you'll be gone. Elena took the schedule. Her fingers didn't tremble. Thank you, she said. Don't thank me, Sarah replied. Just make sure whatever you do actually matters. Elena left the car and walked back to her apartment through the rain. The water ran down her face, cold and sharp. She had 3 days. 72 hours. Tuesday night at 7 p.m. the ICU would receive a nurse who was technically not on any roster, who would know exactly what she was looking for, who would have the medical knowledge to do what needed to be done. In those 3 days, Elena didn't sleep. She reviewed Commander Harding's medication protocols one more time. She checked the medical supply closet inventory that Sarah had texted her, everything she'd need was there. A 14-gauge needle. Saline flush. The kind of things that no one would question a nurse using. The kind of things that could reverse what Caldwell had spent 2 years building. On Tuesday afternoon, she showered and dressed in clothes that didn't exist. Black scrubs with no name tag. A surgical mask she'd carry but not wear until the moment mattered. Her husband's old jacket with the Ramadi patch. At 6:38 p.m., her phone buzzed one final time. A message from Sarah: shift covers until 7 a.m. No one checking ICU rooms until 8. You've got about an hour. Good luck. Elena drove to Sacred Heart in silence. The rain had finally stopped. The parking garage was mostly empty, the fluorescent lights casting everything in the color of bones. She sat in her car for 7 minutes, hands on the steering wheel, breathing in and out the way she'd learned in combat medicine: oxygen in, carbon dioxide out, the body remembering how to survive what the mind already knew was coming. She opened the car door and stepped into the night. The ICU corridor at 11:11 p.m. was a different animal than day shift: fewer eyes, slower response times, the kind of darkness that comes from exhaustion rather than actual night. Elena had called Sarah at home, begged to swap Tuesday's rotation. Sarah didn't ask why. She just texted back, "Done. Good luck." Caldwell had no idea. He'd be in the parking garage now, heading home to a house that never felt like one, the kind of man who left work but never actually left. Elena moved through the ward with her badge clipped to her scrubs, her movements precise, unremarkable, a night nurse doing night nurse things. Routine was camouflage. She passed Commander Harding's room on her third circuit. The monitors weren't alarming yet. They were worse than alarming. They were silent. The ventilator wheezed its mechanical rhythm, steady and wrong, and above it, nothing. No heart monitor beeping. Just the flat, dead sound of a room where someone was dying in real time. She stopped. Look back. His oxygen saturation glowed on the monitor, 71% and dropping. At the nurse's station, his alarm had been muted. Not silenced by accident. Overridden. Deliberately. Someone had coded it out of the system, the kind of move only a doctor could make, the kind of move that left a digital signature. Caldwell was banking on no one checking, because who checks the logs on a guy in a coma? Elena's heart rate didn't climb. Her hands didn't shake. This was the part she'd trained for 17 years ago in the dust outside Fallujah. Pain is information. Panic is a luxury. She entered the room without permission. Harding lay sedated, his face slack, the skin around his mouth starting to show the grey pallor of hypoxia. His chest barely moved. The lain in his arm was running 2 medications, propofol and midazolam, both heavy sedatives, both running at double what a comatose patient should receive. The numbers on the monitor told the story: oxygen saturation 68 now, heart rate slowing to 44, the body shutting down because the brain wasn't getting air. His airway was compromised. Not by swelling, not by obstruction. By deliberate overmedication. By a doctor keeping him chemically unable to wake up, unable to speak, unable to testify. Elena had 2 minutes. Maybe less. She called for the crash cart, but her hands were already moving. The attending was downstairs with a trauma, 3 floors away. The code would take time to mobilize. Harding didn't have time. His lips were turning blue. His oxygen saturation hit 62. She reached for the emergency airway kit with the kind of certainty that comes from having done this before, not on a training dummy, on a 19-year-old lance corporal named Miguel whose lungs had filled with fluid from a blast wound, whose body was shutting down in the back of a Chinook, whose eyes were looking at hers asking if he was going to die. She hadn't let him. She wasn't going to let Harding either. The cricothyrotomy wasn't the textbook procedure they taught in nursing school, the careful measured one with anesthesia and time. It was the Ramadi version. The field version. The version she performed 147 times while rounds of fire hammered the FOB walls and men screamed and the desert turned the color of blood. She palpated the cricothyroid membrane, found the exact spot where a blade could go without hitting the carotid, and moved. 1 cut. Clean. The sound was like tearing leather. She used the 14-gauge angiocath needle from the airway kit, threaded it through the opening, and attached the oxygen line. Not ideal. Perfect. Harding's oxygen saturation climbed. 73, 79. 85, the ventilator's rhythm synced with his natural breathing, the two systems working together now, the airway open, the lungs receiving air. His heart rate came up. His color returned. The monitors started beeping in the normal ranges, not the alarming ranges, the living ranges. She'd stabilized him in 97 seconds. She was still washing the blood from her hands when the crash cart arrived and Dr. Caldwell burst through the door behind it. He wasn't in his white coat. He was in casual clothes, grey sweater, jeans, the kind of thing he wore when he left here, when he tried to be human. His face went from confusion to shock to rage in the time it took him to understand what he was looking at. A patient he'd spent 2 years keeping sedated, now awake. A procedure he hadn't authorized. A nurse standing at the sink, hands steady, eyes meeting his. "What the hell have you done?" His voice came out like something breaking. Elena turned off the water. "Didn't rush. Didn't apologize. I saved his life. Something you've been preventing for 2 years." She said it the way a person states facts. The way a person who knows exactly what they've witnessed states facts. His airway was compromised. Oxygen saturation 62 and dropping. He would have been dead in another minute. Caldwell's hands clenched. His jaw worked. But he couldn't move, couldn't speak, couldn't do anything but stand there watching her dry her hands on a towel like the world hadn't just shifted under his feet. She walked past him to Harding's bedside, checked the vitals one more time, and noted everything in the chart with the precision of someone who'd just performed an emergency surgical procedure. Procedure performed, emergency cricothyrotomy via percutaneous needle. Reason: acute airway compromise, respiratory distress, oxygen saturation critically low. Time: 11:49 p.m. Response: patient stabilized. She signed her name. Major Elena Martinez, RN. She even used the rank, there in the chart where only a few people would ever understand what it meant. Within 8 hours, the hammer fell like it had been waiting in the dark for permission to drop. By 7:45 a.m., Caldwell had filed a formal complaint with the hospital's credentialing committee, practicing medicine without a license, performing an unauthorized surgical procedure, violating patient access restrictions, endangering a patient through reckless medical intervention. By 8:38 a.m., he'd called the Texas Board of Nursing personally, his voice smooth and concerned, the voice of a doctor worried about a nurse who'd overstepped her authority. By 9:15 a.m., a security officer was escorting Elena to her locker, confiscating her badge, handing her a sealed envelope from Human Resources. Mandatory disciplinary hearing. 1 week. Pending termination. The other nurses watched. Sarah had already been transferred to a satellite clinic 40 miles out, a sudden reassignment that left no one to testify on Elena's behalf. The day shift staff wouldn't meet her eyes. Mrs. Harding, visiting her son, saw it happen from the hallway, saw Elena being walked out by security, saw the empty look on the guards' faces, saw something shift in the world that she didn't understand yet. Elena kept her head level, kept her hands visible, let them escort her like she was dangerous. Like she was the threat. That night, she drove to the cemetery where Carlos was buried. The rain fell hard, the kind of rain that comes before a cold front, that makes the air smell like iron and wet earth. She stood at his grave for 11 minutes before moving, her hands pressed flat against the headstone, the granite cold enough to burn. Private First Class Carlos Antonio Martinez. 22 years old. Killed in action, Fallujah, 2009. She pressed her forehead against the stone. "I couldn't save our son," she whispered. The words came out broken. "I sent him over there. I trained him. I promised him I'd bring him home." She paused. Breathed. "And now I can't save the man who tried. I can't save the one man who saw him die and tried to carry him out. I failed you, Carlos. I failed everyone. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." The rain hammered the cemetery like applause for a show nobody wanted to see. She stood there until the cold made it hard to think, until her body reminded her that pain is information and she was receiving it loud and clear. Then she straightened, wiped her face once, and walked back to her car. Tomorrow there would be a hearing. Tomorrow someone would decide whether she'd broken the rules or saved a life. But tonight, there was only rain and a grave, and the terrible knowledge that she'd finally come home, only to find that home was gone. The hospital's routine background check arrived on a Wednesday morning like a letter bomb addressed to Dr. Caldwell. It was supposed to be administrative paperwork, the kind that gets filed and forgotten. Instead, it flagged something the hospital's legal team hadn't expected to find: a classified security clearance, active and current, attached to a name that didn't match the timid night shift nurse they'd been isolating for 3 weeks. Elena Martinez. Major Elena Martinez. The clearance number alone made the hospital administrator pick up the phone and call the FBI field office in Houston instead of proceeding with the disciplinary hearing they'd scheduled. Within 4 hours, 2 federal agents were sitting in a conference room on the 3rd floor, their presence announced by the metallic click of their credentials against the table. The hearing convened at noon. Elena sat between them, composed as always, her hands folded on the table in front of her. Across from her sat Dr. Caldwell, his expensive suit suddenly looking like costume armor. Beside him were the hospital's legal representatives. And then the witnesses began to arrive. Commander Harding's parents entered first, his father moving with the careful deliberation of a man whose bones had grown brittle with age and grief. Mrs. Harding gripped her husband's arm as they took their seats. An FBI agent opened a folder thick with documents, the kind that only exist in classified databases, and slid it across the table toward the hospital administration. The room's air pressure seemed to drop. The fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical song overhead, indifferent to the moment unfolding beneath them. The lead agent, a woman named Morrison with gray threading through her dark hair and eyes like a surveyor's laser, gestured toward the file. The hospital's legal counsel opened it. Then Commander Harding's father spoke. His voice trembled, not with weakness but with the force of something being held back, emotion compressed into a single word. Major. He'd read the first line. His hand shook as he gripped the document. That's not possible. She's a nurse. His wife squeezed his arm. Read it, Mrs. Morrison said quietly. The hospital's nurse administrator, a woman named Patricia whose face had gone pale as milk, took the file from Harding's father and continued reading aloud. Her voice climbed an octave as the words left her mouth. Major Elena Martinez, Marine Corps Medical Officer, 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines. Silver Star. She paused. The silence was the kind that makes people stop breathing. Bronze Star with Valor. Another pause. This one lasted 3 seconds. 2 Purple Hearts. She looked up from the page, her hand shaking now, and there was something like awe in her voice. And a Navy Cross. The room went dead silent. A SEAL team leader stood from his position near the door. Nobody had noticed when he'd arrived, which is exactly how a SEAL wants it. His name tape read Graves, and he moved toward the table with the controlled precision of someone trained in places most people never speak about. His uniform was crisp, his bearing military brass personified. He placed a photograph on the table. Black and white. Elena in combat fatigues, her hand steady as she worked over a wounded Marine's abdomen in what looked like a forward operating base medical tent. The light from the photograph seemed to come from somewhere harsh and distant. Ramadi, 2007. Graves's voice came out measured, each word weighted like a sledgehammer wrapped in velvet. Major Martinez performed 147 combat surgeries in Ramadi. 147. My entire unit was ambushed outside Sanjin Valley, convoy taking direct fire. She was attached to our FOB as a medical officer. She performed field thoracotomy with a combat knife when our surgical suite was compromised by mortar fire. She carried 3 wounded Marines a half-mile under heavy fire, on her back, one at a time. She has the Navy Cross and 2 Purple Hearts. When she was medically discharged, she'd saved more lives in 18 months than most trauma surgeons save in 10 years. He sat down. The sound of his chair scraping against the floor seemed to echo through the entire building. The FBI agent turned to Dr. Caldwell. His face had gone the color of old bone. The agent's name was Morrison, and her eyes were the color of winter. Doctor, the investigation you initiated into Major Martinez's credentials required us to review all of Commander Harding's medical records under federal protocol. What we found was systematic documentation of deliberate over-medication designed to maintain sedation despite repeated neurological assessments indicating the patient was candidate for consciousness. The original incident report from FOB Shank, dated March 2008, shows 3 Marines died during a surgical procedure under your command. The official cause was listed as equipment failure. The file was flagged for re-examination during the military tribunal process, at which time Commander Harding was scheduled to provide testimony. She opened a second folder. Medical charts. Handwritten notes. Medication orders in Caldwell's handwriting. For 2 years, Doctor, you maintained consciousness suppression using a protocol that would constitute assault. We have evidence you falsified charts, manipulated medication orders, and forged attending physician signatures. You kept that man sedated to prevent testimony that would have ended your career much sooner. The silence that followed was the silence of collapse. Caldwell's attorney whispered something. Caldwell didn't respond. His hands were shaking. He'd miscalculated entirely. He'd seen a woman he could bully. He hadn't seen the invisible armor she carried. He hadn't seen the rank. He hadn't seen the commendation. He hadn't seen any of it because she'd spent years learning how to be invisible. The federal agents arrested him at the table. They didn't use handcuffs, not yet. They simply told him to stand. He did. He walked out of the room like a man moving through water, like each step required calculations his brain could no longer perform. The hospital's legal team began discussing criminal referrals and plea agreements before the door had even closed. 6 months later, Elena stood in the physical therapy wing of Sacred Heart during her afternoon shift. Commander Harding was working with a therapist, his muscles remembering their purpose after 2 years of enforced stillness. He was walking. Actually walking, his gait still slightly uneven but improving every day. His body was waking up. His mind was clearer. The sedation had been gradually reversed, and Harding had spent the last 5 months relearning how to be conscious. When he saw Elena, something shifted in his expression. Recognition. Gratitude. The kind of understanding that passes between people who've both survived things that kill most people. Major Martinez, he said, his voice rough but steady. They told me what you did. In the ICU. She took his hand. His grip was strong now. Getting stronger. You tried to bring my son home, Commander. I owed you that much. He held her hand between both of his. Your son was a hero. He died saving Marines under my command. I couldn't. His voice cracked. She squeezed gently. I know. I know you tried. Mrs. Harding appeared in the doorway, and when she saw Elena, she crossed the room with purpose and wrapped her arms around her. The embrace lasted a long time. You gave me my son back, Mrs. Harding whispered into Elena's shoulder. You gave me my son back. Elena's hand moved to the older woman's back, and for the first time in 3 years, the weight seemed to shift slightly. It didn't disappear. But it shifted. It became something she could carry instead of something that was carrying her. That evening, Elena walked through Sacred Heart's main lobby at the end of her shift. She wore her husband's old jacket despite the Houston heat, the faded Ramadi unit patch visible now on the shoulder where she'd carefully stitched it back into place. She didn't hide it anymore. She'd earned the right to carry it openly. The night security guard station was manned by someone she recognized. Dr. Caldwell stood in an ill-fitting grey uniform, his name tape slightly crooked, checking employee badges as staff streamed past. He'd pleaded guilty to charges of obstruction of justice and evidence tampering. He'd surrendered his medical license. His wife had divorced him. His career was a corpse. This job, checking badges at the hospital he'd once run, was the only work his attorney could secure. The hospital had hired him through legal pressure, the kind that comes from settlements and plea agreements. He was a ghost haunting the building he used to own. When Elena approached the station, Caldwell's hand trembled as he reached for her ID badge. She handed it to him. He scanned it without looking at her face. The machine beeped. Approved. She took one measured breath. Her voice came out low and even, the voice of someone who'd commanded Marines under fire. The quietest person in the room might be holding it all together. Doctor. You should have remembered that. She took her badge back, turned, and walked through the glass doors into the warm Houston evening. Behind her, Caldwell stood frozen at his post, his hand still hovering where her badge had been, the weight of his choices pressing down on him like gravity itself. He would stand that station for the next 3 years until his plea agreement terms were satisfied. Every shift, every badge, every reminder of what he'd destroyed. That night, Elena drove to the cemetery. The sun was dropping toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of copper and amber. She parked her truck and walked to her husband's grave. The headstone was simple. Name. Rank. Dates. She knelt on the grass. The earth was still warm from the day's heat. She touched the stone with her fingertips. I saved him, MIMOR. Commander Harding is going to be okay. He walked today. He's going to make it. She pressed her forehead against the cold granite. Our son didn't die for nothing. His commander lived. And I made sure of it. She stood, straightened her jacket, and touched the Ramadi patch one more time. The faded thread caught the last light of the sun. The weight she'd carried for 3 years, the guilt, the rage, the terrible knowledge that her son had been lost, it didn't vanish. But in that moment, watching the light catch the stitching of the unit patch, she felt something like permission. Permission to set some of it down. Permission to breathe. She walked back to her truck. Tomorrow she'd return to Sacred Heart. Tomorrow she'd train the next generation of trauma nurses, the ones who'd never fired a weapon but would need the same steady hands, the same composure, the same willingness to sacrifice. She had work to do. She had a second chance. And she was going to use it. Subscribe for more stories where quiet strength defeats corruption. Like this video if you believe heroes walk among us in places we never expect. Comment, what would you have done if you were Elena? The answer matters. It says who you are.